All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm Carolyn Kousky. I'm the Executive Director of the Wharton Risk Center, and thank you all so much for joining us for today's webinar on the findings from the forthcoming report of the California Climate Insurance Working Group. This webinar is part of a series that the Wharton Risk Center is doing through the latter half of 2021 on topics around insurance and climate change. And you can see more about the series and the other upcoming webinars on our website. I also just wanted to make everyone aware that this is being recorded and will be posted on that website afterwards for later viewing. Please feel free to introduce yourself and where you're from in chat to all attendees so everyone can see who's on and where folks are from. And then use the Q&A function to put in any questions to our panelists, and the moderator will be using not the chat box, but the Q&A box to look for questions from everyone later on. And so with that, I would like to turn this over to today's moderator. We'll take it from there. Mike Peterson.
Thanks very much, Carolyn, and thanks to everyone for tuning in and welcome. My name is Michael Peterson, and I'm the Deputy Commissioner for Climate and Sustainability for the California Department of Insurance. Unfortunately, Commissioner Ricardo Lara had an unexpected and unavoidable conflict and is unable to attend. But I'm excited to be here with you today. I'm grateful for the Wharton Risk Center for hosting this timely and important webinar. The consequences of climate change are being felt in communities throughout the world. Here in the Western United States and parts of Canada, where I've spent most of my time, we're in the midst of dangerous and compounding heat waves. This is a climate impact that causes significant health problems and deaths. And among the many important climate policy discussions, this is one that is right in front of us. The webinar today is timely because it focuses on an issue of resilience and insurance that is critical, but it fits nicely with the other climate policy discussions on emissions reductions from vehicles, methane and HFC emissions, and ESG investing. And it's a critical part of climate adaptation. This panel today is going to focus on draft recommendations that have resulted from the collaborative work and conversations of the Climate Insurance Working Group in California. That Climate Insurance Working Group has been taking an innovative and thoughtful approach to climate resilience and the role of insurance, both now and in the future. These recommendations are draft and will be finalized by the working group in the coming weeks, and then put out in a forthcoming report, which I hope that you all will read as it comes out. The recommendations themselves try to approach complex problems by looking at creative solutions and new ideas. And the hope is that these will be refined over time as pilot projects and concepts are proposed, examined, attempted, and reviewed. So I first want to share a bit of history that encapsulates a few essential points regarding the Climate Insurance Working Group. In 2018, the California State Legislature passed a bill directing the convening of the Climate Insurance Working Group to tackle problems related to climate change and insurance, but also recruiting nature as part of that process. That legislation had several themes, but three stand out: pre-disaster risk reduction, insurance, and nature, and how they can reinforce each other to promote a more resilient California. In fact, a major impetus for the working group was the concept that nature-based insurance solutions could be supported by new insurance ideas and reduce risks across a community to make insurance more affordable and available. That insurance concepts could be interwoven with wetlands that absorb storm surge from the ocean, or urban forests that mitigate heat waves, or that approaches to forest management could reduce wildfire risk, or pieces of that legislation that were really important. And the working group has taken that forward in its recommendations. When you pull together risk mitigation, insurance concepts with nature-based approaches, you need a variety of expertise. And I appreciate all those who are participating today and the broader working group of climate and policy experts that continue to contribute to this initiative. The working group has 18 members. They started their work in September 2019. And over the past 2 years, they've met publicly to discuss problems and solutions related to climate risk and some of the mitigation actions that could address those risks. As many of you will recognize, reducing risk has multiple layers of governance, multiple scales of action, and many potential priorities. And so this is a complicated issue. The working group chose to focus on three perils: wildfire, extreme heat, and flooding. They emphasized the need to prioritize equity and closing the protection gap. They also chose to consider both top-down and bottom-up approaches to addressing these perils. And finally, they acknowledged that some of the work would progress faster and some would be more long-term, and so that this would be a process that had both short-term and long-term goals. To root the conversation in California's recent experience, I wanted to point out a few observations. As I noted earlier, California is in the midst of substantial drought and a series of heat waves at the same time. This creates a number of risks and exacerbates some of the underlying risks that California already has. We also are at a point where mitigation actions, both on the community and state level, are trying to address many of these same risks. 2020 was a record year of extreme heat in California, and the last few weeks have shown that that is not an anomaly. The working group was wise to focus on extreme heat and also to take an integrated approach to not lose sight of how multiple perils could compound the climate impacts in California. I have a quick note also on flood. Since 1992, every county in California has been declared a federal disaster area at least once from a flooding event. Most recently, 2 years ago in Sonoma County, an atmospheric river flooded nearly 2,600 homes and businesses, many of them without flood insurance. California also has a devastating recent history with wildfires. We have tragically lost lives, seen a record number of acres burned, large-scale evacuations, and difficulty with insurance availability and affordability. Wildfire insurance availability has shrunk in recent years while premiums have increased. In my view, the questions asked by this working group today are even more timely right now than they were when the legislation was passed. This working group is focused on the physical risks to health structures and resilience, and have kind of left open the possibility that the three perils that they've chosen, wildfire, extreme heat, and flooding, could be models for additional perils that become more and more important as we move into the future. To address these perils, the working group took a full look at the risk continuum, looking at risk assessment, risk communication, risk reduction, and also opportunities for risk transfer. This puts an emphasis on the upstream factors that impact insurance availability, but are the ones where mitigation can have the greatest impact. Ultimately, the affordability of an area and the safety of an area are both improved by reducing risks. So with that framing, it's my pleasure to welcome our panelists. First, I'd like to introduce Alice Hill. She is the chair of the Climate Insurance Working Group. She's a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, and her work on the Council on Foreign Relations focuses on the risks, consequences, and responses associated with climate change. She previously served as a special assistant to President Barack Obama and senior director for resilience policy on the National Security Council. She also has a new book coming out, The Fight for Climate After COVID-19, next month. Next, I'd like to introduce Serena Sowers, who's a working group member and focuses on climate resilience as Vice President and Senior Client Manager for Swiss Re's Public Sector Solutions Division, where she's able to address community solutions to climate problems. Raghav Kulu is a working group member and Senior Vice President for Natural Catastrophe Solutions at Munich Re. One of his focus points has been increasing community resilience, including through public-private partnerships. And last, you have already been introduced to our host, Dr. Management and Decision Processes Center at the University of Pennsylvania, where she also directs the policy incubator. Carolyn's research focuses on multiple aspects of disaster insurance markets, climate risk management, and policy approaches for increasing resilience. She's the author of a recent book, A Blueprint for Coastal Adaptation. I will welcome you once again. Thank you all for being here. And Alice, I'll pass the baton to you and ask you to offer your thoughts and comments on the overarching themes of the draft report.
Well, thank you so much. I want to just express my appreciation to the Vice Chair of the Working Group, Carolyn Kousky, and the Wharton Center for hosting this event, as well as my extraordinary co-panelists whom I saw in action as we struggled with the issue of what role can insurance play in solving and protecting our communities against climate change. When I first got the call to participate on this working group for the California Department of Insurance, I immediately flashed back on a conversation I had in 2016. I was in Hartford, Connecticut, meeting with the CEO of a reinsurance company. And I remember his office just had a gorgeous view of the Connecticut River. It felt incredibly peaceful, but then the conversation turned to climate change. As we sat in his office, the CEO expressed his concern that climate risk would grow too large for even the reinsurers, of course, the insurance companies that insure insurance companies against catastrophic risk. And before we could get far in the conversation, he said, "And you know what that means, don't you?" And his answer was, "It means that governments will have to pay for the damage if they can." In other words, as private insurance companies stop offering insurance in the face of escalating risks from climate change, insurance coverage, private insurance coverage would shrink, leaving millions of people at risk for economic harm as a result of these damaging impacts. And of course, catastrophic risks have caused private insurance companies to exit insurance markets before. After Hurricane Andrew inflicted unprecedented losses in Florida in the early 90s, the state strengthened both its building codes for wind and insurance, as well as insurance oversight to keep insurers from fleeing the state and or raising their premiums beyond any level of affordability for residents in Florida. We've seen this happen internationally as well. A similar story unfolded in Australia in 2012, where one of the largest general insurers in Australia stopped offering and renewing policies in an area that had suffered successive floods in a very short time frame. And of course, in the United States, when private insurers thought the flood risk had grown too big, the federal government created the National Flood Insurance Program, a program that continues to be troubled, having to borrow extensively from the federal government and still widely perceived as being underwater, so to speak. So the working group had a mission, an important mission, to figure out what are the solutions to encourage the private sector, the insurance sector, to remain active and engaged in supporting communities and people in finding insurance solutions to the climate crisis. How could this group identify the path for insurance companies to want to continue to play a vital role in transferring some of the risk from climate change away from individuals and businesses? So the report does, in my opinion, the draft report does important work in identifying some of the broad areas that need immediate focus. The first is that we need much better communication of risk. Many individuals in the United States simply don't appreciate what's ahead, what's already occurring. Even though we have very vivid examples right now, they do not understand their flood, wildfire, or heat risks or other risks from climate change. The group also recommends that in the draft report that we improve our focus on building and land use practices. Where and how we build matters deeply when it comes to reducing risk. And if we can reduce risk before the bad thing happens, private insurers will have much greater interest in remaining in the market. Increasing insurance coverage to reduce long-term economic loss is also important. Climate change has been described as the tragedy of the horizon. Over time, the events will get worse. Even if we're successful in cutting our emissions to zero, we are in for some more severe heating, which brings more severe events. And so we need to look at what does that do in terms of long-term economic loss, and how can insurance protect us against some of that damage? Of course, we also need to look to nature. Our ecosystems can provide much better protection for us in some instances than things that humans can build. Sometimes a mangrove forest or continuing to protect wetlands provides much better and safer protection than building a seawall. So how can insurance help drive those nature-based solutions? We need innovation in this space, no question. It's going to require all of us to think differently about insurance than we have before, and equity concerns have to overlay every decision here, because one thing's clear with climate change. It's going to hit our most vulnerable people and communities the hardest. Any of us can turn on the news to see why all of this matters. Our systems are not prepared, whether they're human-made or natural, for the extremes we're experiencing. Just look at February. We had that cold freeze in Texas that caused $130 billion in losses because our electrical grid could not perform, and then cascading failures followed from that. Or the heat wave in the Northwest right now. We're seeing excess deaths as a result of that, as well as peremptory shutdowns of power just when people need it the most. And we don't have air conditioning for many of the buildings that people are suffering through right now with temperatures well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The risk remains that private insurance companies may choose not to do business in this space in the face of more extreme climate-fueled disasters. Of course, to have success, building resilience will require many players, not just insurance companies, but many players across our communities, our governments, the private sector. And that's why the recommendations in this draft report are so wide-ranging and why they call on different entities to step up to address the growing climate risk. Much thought was applied by our working group. I was so impressed by their dedication, diligence, and thoughtfulness in approaching these issues. We can all have a better future if insurance continues to play a role in crafting that future. The draft recommendations the working group has provided, I believe, will, if followed, leave not only the state of California, but the nation on a far better course going forward. So I really am looking forward to hearing the comments of my co-panelists, but also from our audience. This is an all hands on deck problem, and all ideas are good. We're just at the beginning of this journey, but it's so important we make the first steps important and informative steps going forward. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Alice. I really appreciate your comments and leadership on the group. I think this is a good segue to ask Carolyn, given your vast research in disaster insurance and risk reduction, if you could talk a little bit about the interaction between recommendations in the report and how insurance plays a role in resilience generally.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Mike. Thanks, Alice, and thanks to all the members of this working group. I'll step back a bit and talk about the role of insurance in promoting climate resilience broadly, and also why it's critical that we really try to preserve insurability in the face of those risks and concerns that Alice just discussed. Our working group was thinking about these roles of insurance and investigating some of the more recent innovations in risk transfer to push the contribution of insurance beyond just its typical role in recovery. But let me start there because its role in recovery is sort of the most foundational, right? Insurance is absolutely essential to coming back after these weather-related disasters. There's now this growing body of research that all points to the fact that those with insurance, households, small businesses, recover better and tend to recover faster than those without insurance. And that's simply because there really are no other sources of funding often, or they're insufficient or too delayed to really help with the extraordinary costs that disasters impose. Very few households have the necessary savings to rebuild after a devastating disaster on their own. They can be locked out of access to credit. And this is maybe for another conversation, but we know that federal aid is not always available. And when it is, it's often limited and takes quite a long time to get to people. So that makes insurance really important to helping people get back on their feet. But insurance has also been linked to sort of broader household well-being, because when households have insurance, then that means they don't need to engage in other types of coping strategies that can be really harmful to them and the members of their household. For example, they don't have to transfer funds from other important expenditures like, say, healthcare. They don't have to take on additional debt or use up all their savings just to get their home safe again and cover sort sort of all those other myriad expenses that disasters create. And when people don't have that type of financial safety net, it causes stress and anxiety, which I think is, is pretty self-evident if you think about the recovery process. And finally, there's also some initial work suggesting that as take-up rates for disaster insurance expand within a community, it can improve not just the individual households or small businesses recovery, but actually community level outcomes post-disaster as well. And that's because people can get back to their normal economic activities much faster, right? When they have the resources to rebuild their own, what they need to do first. So that was all just to really set the stage for why insurance is so important after a disaster. And so our working group did spend time on this aspect of recovery and how we can help insurance actually do that better, right? Because we know that right now, many people, especially those most in need, as Alice was saying, don't have the disaster insurance that they need. So our report investigates how we can sort of broaden take-up rates for disaster insurance, and specifically what types of policies could help make insurance accessible to those who couldn't otherwise afford it or have been sort of typically locked out of insurance markets. And we look at innovations, things like community-based insurance, which I think my fellow panelists will discuss in a bit, and how these types of innovations can help fill this gap. But we also then looked at other roles that insurance can play. We thought about how insurance can be used to promote greater investments in risk reduction. That could happen both before disaster hits, but also after, and done in a number of ways. One is through things like, financial incentives, things like premium reductions. But we also looked at other approaches, things like deeper partnerships between insurers and communities around the most effective risk reduction investments in order to help maintain that availability and affordability of insurance, which, as Alice mentioned, we're really at risk of right now. Also, insurers invest a lot in sophisticated risk analysis and understanding of risk. And we spent a lot of time thinking about how maybe the insurance sector could help promote deeper risk awareness and understanding among all types of consumers. And then finally, our group tried to push insurance into new areas, right? And Mike already mentioned an emerging conversation is what role insurance can play in promoting nature-based approaches to lower disaster losses. And so we investigated those as well. So I'll just close again, and I just want to highlight again sort of what Mike and Alice both mentioned, which is that the working group really felt strongly that insurance is most effective when it's just one piece of this overall risk management strategy. Risk transfer has to be complemented with good risk communication and awareness and our investments in risk reduction. So I hope that the report is really broadening the conversation from that narrow look at insurance policies to these bigger questions of what effective climate risk management looks like in the face of these, radically worsening extreme events. So thanks so much, and back to you, Mike.
Thanks very much, Carolyn. I really appreciate it. I think that you hit the nail on the head there, that the overall risk management strategy is critical, and that the working group spent a lot of time trying to think, how can we broaden the role of insurance to close the protection gap and think about new areas like nature or other areas where insurance can play a strong role in resilience. And I think that I'd like to pass it over to Serena to add on to that concept and offer your thoughts on where you think that there are opportunities.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. I am really grateful to have had the opportunity to be part of the Climate Insurance Working Group, and really am grateful for Commissioner Lara, Mike, Alice, and Carolyn to bring together a really diverse group of practitioners in the field who can really challenge each other on our expertise, so we could come up with a more a better solution than we would have come up on our own, to think about Californians, think about the most vulnerable within California, and figure out how we can make the type of recommendations that will really put the most vulnerable at the center for our recommendations. And I am part of the extreme heat subgroup, and really I benefited from the folks who really challenged the question around what role insurance can play and what role insurance should play in helping address these big questions. As Alice mentioned, the impacts of climate change are right here, from Pacific Northwest to the East Coast to LA to Alaska. We are seeing heat waves across the board. And at the heart of it, we know that climate change doesn't affect everyone equally. we know climate change disproportionately, and especially extreme heat, disproportionately affects the low-income individuals, immigrants, people of color, the elderly, and the disabled. And this is the reality of the future that we are dealing with. And we can't just solve for it as a society as a whole, but we need to start with thinking about these specific vulnerable populations and figure out how we can provide solutions that address this group as well as the rest of society together. I think Commissioner Lara said it best a few weeks back when he said, we can't have a future where climate change separates the wealthy from the rest. And I think that really is at the heart of so much of how we went about thinking about extreme heat and challenging ourselves to figure out what type of solutions do we need to have in place so that we can have that social infrastructure and the physical infrastructure in place to support individuals through extreme heat. And then ask the question, what role can insurance play in enabling those factors? So with that, I wanted to point to a few things that the insurance working group focused on. Really, we had a thought exercise around how can we provide solutions for individuals before and during a heat event and not just after a heat event. I mean, we always think about insurance, as Carolyn pointed out, as something that helps you with a recovery, but is there a role insurance can play before and during? And our thought exercise was really around, can we equip community centers with the cold water to medical checkups to other kinds of services that bring people into the community centers before the event. So as the heat event unfolds, people know where to go. People know where to get the help. People know where to get the kind of support that they needed. And then we progressively thought about other kinds of social intervention points like public transportation. Can there be subsidies for public transportation so we can get people off the streets as quickly as possible, where there's a cooler environment to get them from point A to point B, preferably to locations where they can get the help that they need. Also, can cities and counties provide subsidies for individuals to get subsidies for electricity so that they get the care that they need? Because one of the fundamental things that we know about extreme heat is the recovery overnight, the rejuvenation period overnight is so important for individuals to be able to deal with a multiple day event. And finally, and this is one of the recommendations I'm going to focus this discussion on, is thinking about hospital systems and how do we use insurance to boost up the hospital systems. So insurance can play a role in all of these mechanisms that I talked about, from equipping community centers to the utilities to public transportation. But when it comes to the hospital system, we really challenged ourselves to think not just about the underinsurance, but the public infrastructure issue. Are hospitals, our healthcare systems equipped enough to address the needs of these vulnerable populations? So we really thought about a parametric insurance product that would allow for funding to be available for cities, counties, and hospitals, public hospitals, to provide the care that these vulnerable populations will need, to set up extra beds, to set up an annex, to set up any kind of resources that they would need to respond to an extreme heat event like this. So this would allow for a community to quickly provide the social infrastructure to embrace the individuals and not let funding be the reason. Especially when someone with perhaps Medicaid or other kinds of government government healthcare program that supports them, government health plan that supports them, to be limited by the kind of care that they would need. So the hospital and the city can really make the decision around what a holistic support for the individual looks like during the heat event, so that the individual doesn't have to come back when there's a true emergency. So these are the types of social infrastructure and social cohesion ideas that we really played around with and really challenged ourselves, where can insurance play a role? And here we really believe exploring pilots around what a parametric product could look like so that funding is available for communities to respond in a agile and flexible way. It was really critical for our thinking. So fundamentally, for the extreme heat working group, we knew that going into this 2 years ago, pilots are going to be critical in thinking about how we can best serve the needs of population. Like I said in the beginning, climate change affects individuals disproportionately. And a recent study we did at Swiss Re indicated that if we don't take the necessary steps to meet the goals set by the Paris Climate Accords, we are likely to have anywhere from 10 to 20% decline in our GDP over the next 30 years. And what this means is so disproportionate when it comes to the US, where we anticipate that decline to be 10%, versus Indonesia, where we expect that impact to be 40%. And that also applies at the micro level. You can take any city and that type of impact is going to happen between the wealthy and the lowest and the poorest in the community. So for us, as we think about the pilots, it's really about building the infrastructure, testing out new ideas, testing out ways where we can build an infrastructure around individuals so we as a society can provide the support these individuals who are going to be most impacted by climate change, who are most impacted by climate change today, can be supported. So I'm really looking forward to figuring out how we can implement some of these ideas.
Thanks, Serena. I appreciate your comments. And I think that, you bring up 2 points that I want to just underscore if I can, and that anticipation really does help. And so the degree to which we can do pre-disaster investment or insurance policies can think more upstream than recovery, that's not only protective of financial resources, but it's also critical for protecting the most vulnerable communities, because those are the ones where recovery will already be hardest and where we need to focus as much attention as possible. So I appreciate that. And also, this working group does bridge insurance out into the realm of extreme heat in some creative proposals and pilots. And I think that type of pilot projects and experimentation is critical to envisioning what policies could protect vulnerable populations in the future and today. So thanks very much. And I'll pass it over to Raghavir to finish off our first section here. Without further ado, go ahead, Raghavir.
Thank you, Mike. Also want to echo my thanks again to Carolyn and the Wharton Risk Center. Really, this is a great webinar and a very timely and important one, as Alice mentioned. And also wanted to thank Commissioner Lara and Mike to consider me for this working group. So just been an exciting last 1.5 to 2 years when we worked on some of these recommendations. And as all the panelists mentioned, right, there were multiple challenges that we had to look into, and while coming up with these recommendations. And I want to. It was really interesting to hear Alice's comments on the CEO's concern, right, and about climate change and how this would be important. And as Mike mentioned, one of the themes for the working group was to close the protection gap. Right now, we're talking about closing the protection gap, which already exists, and we have a problem like climate change, which is going to exacerbate that protection gap. So it was particularly challenging to come up with some of these really, really important recommendations, I think. I don't think we have to. At least I have to say anything about climate change, as Alice and Mike have already mentioned what's happening in California and also all across the U.S. and the world. But let me start with saying one of the things that we had to look was how insurance could be a key mechanism. But for that, we also had to go back to the fundamentals. And I was part of both the flood and the wildfire groups. And the fundamental is that insurance works as a feedback loop, right? If there is a certain value at risk, and then there is a standard deviation, which is the variance of how year on year the fluctuations could happen. Now, in a stable climate, we would say that insurance works perfect, right? Because we see that fluctuation, but overall that value at risk kind of stays same in a stable climate. but that is now changing. In the future, that we are seeing a trend. We're seeing a trend in the last few years too, right? So, and that trend has been quite significant. So how does that value at risk go? It increases, but more importantly, the standard deviation also increases. So that really impacts the premiums, because the premiums are directly tied to both the value at risk as well as the standard deviation. So it's really important for us to understand that feedback loop, right? Because as we talk about how insurance can be a solution, we also have to always come back to the affordability. Premiums can't just keep rising, and that's what Alice mentioned about the CEO's concern. At some point, that will have to stop, right? It's not that there's always going to be a price for the insurance, but is it really affordable? Probably not. And at that point, the insurance industry probably will pull out, right? So in terms of how do we address resilience? When, as Mike mentioned, the group was really looking at the bottom up and the top down approaches, right? How do we, again, closing the protection gap? How do we increase that take-up rate for some of these perils like flood, and also wildfire has a high take-up rate, but we don't want that to reduce over time, because as I said, with climate change, it could become unaffordable. So how do we maintain or increase that take-up rate? And innovation is going to be, it will be critical. It's just not important. It's going to be critical to think about what kind of solutions will we have to come up with. And Serena touched on all those, not just after the event, but also before the event. And then we have to talk about the top-down approach, which is when mitigation plays a key role. Again, as I talked about that feedback loop, what is still possible to maintain that feedback loop and to manage that risk? I think mitigation is going to be key, really critical to how do we reduce or manage that value at risk, and also manage the standard deviation. So with that, some of the recommendations that came up with, and these were some of the recommendations were cross-cutting, especially the role of mitigation. That's there for all the three perils that the working group was looking into, but also for some perils like wildfire and flood, there were also some cross-cutting recommendations where innovation like community insurance and how does the role of the mitigation play a role within that community insurance? Because we all know mitigation is not a one-size-fits-all. Every community has its own risks, and every community can better understand and also better address their risks in terms of mitigation. So in fact, California is very well positioned to address community level mitigation, because as per the 1979 Beverly Act, there is already the GAD districts that are in place. And these are the geological hazard abatement district. So one of the recommendations of this working group was, how do we catalyze new climate hazard abatement districts, right? So how does the community understand, do they understand their risk, and how can they reduce their risk, and tie that into something like a community insurance? Now, as I said, when we talk about the insurance, the feedback loop, there is a value at risk. And when we actually start combining this community level risk, there could be better solutions that could be offered. And in fact, if mitigation can be actually considered within the community risk, then I think the affordability can be addressed as well. So yeah, these were really, really critical like recommendations, and we feel that this could be a game changer, especially for California, but also for other places in the U.S. And on finally, again, the nature-based solutions, right? The top-down approach. We can't forget nature, right? And the report really points out how in Superstorm Sandy, about 600 million of damage was avoided because of the coastal wetlands. So how does nature play a role? Well, nature plays a role in reducing, but also nature faces an impact after the event. So we need to restore this nature. So some wetlands can get impacted. We need to restore them. And with extreme heat and droughts, these wetlands can get impacted too. So we need to manage those natural infrastructures as well. We need to invest in them, as some of all the panelists mentioned, right? So all this comes together in terms of combining risk mitigation and risk transfer as a new way forward, because we just have to think about creative solutions to make insurance sustainable in the future. So with that, I'll hold my thoughts. Thank you so much again for having me part of this panel.
Thank you, Raghavir. Really appreciate your comments, and that is a major theme of how do you bridge together risk mitigation with risk transfer. I also want to just highlight that one of the example you brought up about Superstorm Sandy. When you avoid damages, not only is that critical to the lives and safety and the buildings themselves, but that does help future affordability of insurance in those areas. And so I think that ways in which we can avoid damages does help solve some of the protection gap problems in the same piece. So thanks very much for your comments. I have a couple of follow-up questions I wanted to ask a few of the panelists in my powers as moderator here. So I'll start with Serena and then kind of we'll see how much time we have here. But Serena, for one of the big things here for me is how do we learn from past events? And this protection gap issue is really critical because that gap is disproportionately impacting our most vulnerable communities. And so I just wanted to start with you and say, what do you think we've learned from recent storms and heat waves and wildfires about who gets left behind as communities attempt to rebuild? And are there ways in which this report tries to help address those gaps?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important question to ask, because often as an insurance industry, when we think about the protection gap, we think about it in large numbers. We think about kind of the industry-wide loss, and we think about what is insured and what is not. And in the process, we kind of lose the individuals and the lives that are impacted by it. So I think you're asking a really critical question. I think at the heart of it, we have to start with marginalized individuals in the center of the solutions that we come up with, and they can't just be in the margins of how we approach the climate solutions that we are discussing, right? And the reality of the climate impacts, and as we understand the impacts that it's having on communities, it affects the same individuals over and over and over again, because the locations that they can afford carry that fundamental risk over and over again. Individuals who move away from locations due to flood often find themselves in equally flood-prone locations, and the kind of social inequities that dominate our society perpetuates these issues over and again. I think perhaps I might challenge the group or challenge the larger audience to consider that we often talk about insurance take-up rates when it comes to how do we close the protection gap. I would say that is a step, but that is somewhat a one-dimensional step, because the populations we are talking about can fundamentally afford many things, including insurance. So for me, the challenge and the question to ask is not just about how do you convince that individual to purchase insurance, but how do we as a society figure out how to cover these individuals. Raghavir talked about the community-based solutions, and I think that's one angle, but the reality is governments are so fundamentally exposed to the risk of climate change, and they end up paying for climate change for what is not insured, because they have to support the individuals who are devastated by these climate changes in the long run. So really you're talking about governments carrying the risk in the long run for the recovery of these individuals. So to answer this question around protection gap, I think we need to think creatively about how can governments start to purchase insurance for this community risk that they carry, for this larger risk that they carry. And also, how do we create that social cohesion that we need over the next few years so we can be responsive to individuals' needs, so people don't fall through the cracks, people are not fundamentally caught in that doom loop where they can't escape the risk no matter how much they try. So to answer this larger question, I really think it comes down to how strong our community is and how we prioritize the community cohesion, and insurance can play a critical role in helping build that cohesion, but it's not just a question of how's the individual protected, but how's the community and the government around them also is protected.
Thank you. No, I think that, I mean, it's a really vicious problem, and I think that, you know, being able to think about how can we use new approaches to address the most vulnerable and marginalized communities is going to be critical to the long-term resilience of not just California, but in anywhere. So, Rakavir, I wanted to ask you a follow-up on a theme that you brought up about combining risk reduction, risk transfer. I think that, you know, for me, that it's a really strong part of this report, and that you know, oftentimes we break those into two categories. We do, you know, pre-disaster risk reduction in one part of the budget, and we worry about recovery when we need it. But could you say a little bit more about how we knit these two concepts together and how that, you know, might lead to more affordability, both in terms of building and also for insurance moving forward?
Sure, Mike, thank you. I think that's going to be, as I mentioned, it's going to be critical as we look at innovation and how insurance can play a role. So let me start by saying, how do the current catastrophe models work, and how does the current the insurance premiums work, right? We look into we look into the past and we say what could potentially happen in the future. So a lot of these models are calibrated with what kind of losses have we experienced, and so some of their implicit assumptions are this nature and the risk mitigation, or the building codes, however way we have mitigated so far, is already inbuilt in these models. But in the future, but these catastrophe models and how we perceive risk is drastically changing. Is changing only mainly because the climate risk is increasing much faster than we can all think of, right? And most of the models have also predicted something, and actually scientists have said that climate change is increasing even faster than a lot of the models that have that come up with. So how do we factor in risk mitigation? We need better building codes. We need nature-based solutions. There's a lot of studies, as one of them I mentioned, about how these coastal wetlands actually reduce the losses in after Superstorm Sandy. So some of these studies actually highlight how much of an impact. Again, these are not a one-size-fits-all. There is region-specific studies that have been done. How do we leverage those in terms of analyzing and reviewing what could the impact be on an insurance? Now, if we have to take that and say, how does it impact one home? It probably is very, very challenging. But if we actually think about it more from a community basis, then yes, this could be done. So one of the studies in the ecological economics, which the Nature Conservancy, the University of California, and Munich Re also was involved in this, was about how some of these coral reefs can actually reduce the storm surge losses in the coastal regions. And there was a clear-cut demonstration of how some of the investment in this risk mitigation or a restoration of these coral reefs could benefit in terms of the reducing impact on the premiums over time, and how that could be amortized into the initial resilience investment. So, and that's specific to coral reefs, but there are studies already being done also to transfer that information into wetlands and so on. So I think that's how the concepts will look like, right? How do we now do a future-looking, not just a past-looking model?
Thanks, Raghu. I think that, being a former scientist or a scientist myself, I really do think that there's an opportunity to integrate what we learn about the natural environment into how we project into the future. So thanks very much for that. Carolyn, I'd like to turn to you and just say, we talk a lot about climate change exacerbating inequities, widening the protection gap. This report really tries to focus on how to close the protection gap. Is there anything that you see in it that you think is sort of an underrated recommendation that can help try to address that protection gap?
Sure, thanks, Mike. I think I'd like to follow up on what Serena was saying, because one of the things we talked about was that there's different groups within the protection gap, right? There are folks who don't have any coverage of all different types and also some limitations. And I think personally, what I think is most important is focusing on how we get assistance to lower income households, because we know they struggle disproportionately after disaster events and they don't have access to any of the other types of financing that could help. So I'd call attention to those recommendations, right? And so there's many different ways here. Raghavir and Serena talked about community models and whether we could broaden coverage that way. So this gets away from the state of California, but we know that Congress has been debating a means tested assistance for the National Flood Insurance Program. And that would, of course, then have implications for residents in California if there could be federal assistance dollars to help with the cost of flood insurance. But we also talked about California doing some sort of state level assistance program on its own. Of course, the big question with something like that, right, is the funding and where it's going to come from. I think we note in the report an interesting example from Morocco, where they recently passed a law to provide natural disaster insurance to lower income households, and they funded it by a small tax on all insurance policies. So that's a type of funding mechanism that could be used. Of course, there's others. And then we also talk about, outside of sort of public sector efforts to try to help provide insurance for these groups, there's also things the private sector could do. So things like micro insurance, right? And I think one of our recommendations is talking about how the Insurance Commissioner's Office could help support pilots for these types of more innovative insurance mechanisms, so that we can get a sense of sort of how to structure them and what works best and what really meets needs. And those are the types of pilots too, as my fellow panelists have mentioned, where California could really pave the way for these types of programs, in the country and worldwide as well. So thanks, Mike.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I think that, we have this international problem of climate risk, and how do you take that broad problem and tailor it to solutions that work on a local level where we see floods, heat waves, fires, and hopefully California can help work on those problems and lead in that area. Well, great. Well, Alice, I want to, finish off with asking you a question here. There's short and long-term concepts that can be prioritized, and there's some that need to be started today so they have an impact in the long run. And so when we talk about resilience, what is one important action from these recommendations that the state could take now that will be foundational to resilience, years into the future?
Well, the report is chock full of recommendations, but there are some that would jumpstart the effort to make this a mitigation of risk before the bad thing happened, so that it's more attractive to insure because the damages will be lower. And one important area there now that is crying for attention is land use and building codes. And certainly when it comes to new development, we should be thinking about how do we make sure we're not adding risk as we go forward, given what we know already about climate change. There is a great deal of uncertainty about climate change, but we're already seeing that some areas will be or are being impacted. So how do we avoid investing in those areas in ways that are not safe? Because then it becomes unattractive to insure. So that gets down to how and where we build. And that requires building codes that are resilient to these events. And California has led on this. And also it requires land use decisions, mapping where the risks are, identifying those, and then thinking thoroughly, giving incentives to communities not to permit further building there, but really trying to figure out how are we going to withdraw from at-risk areas. Very difficult conversations to have, but if you just go forward a number of years, you can see that that decision in hindsight wouldn't look like it wasn't a particularly wise one to build a new building or new road or whatever in an area that will be demolished before the service life of the building or infrastructure is completed. So very difficult things to talk about with those that are involved, but it's a conversation we need to start now, because otherwise we will have literally built bridges to nowhere. We will have just poured money into areas that we know cannot be safe going forward. So that would be one place we could have immediate focus and start the hard work of talking about it in a way that gets people to understand what's at stake.
Thanks, Alice. No, I mean, mapping, community mitigation, pre-disaster planning are so important to the future. And the more we understand about these risks, the more we can make those decisions and have those very challenging but important conversations. Thank you very much. So we'll wrap up here with one question from the audience, and then I'll offer a few quick thoughts at the end before 1 o'clock here, Eastern time. So our one question from the audience says that it looks like customers will pay most of the increasing price due to the uncertainty that's caused by climate change. How can insurance companies help mitigate potential increasing premium? So I'll just toss it out see who wants to go first.
Right, Serena, you want to go ahead, or you want me to get started? All right, okay.
Yeah.
Well, I would say, I mean, that's really an interesting, important question, and also, I mean, it is a true risk, right? In the sense of the increasing premiums, as we said. But the premiums are also what I say is a function of the underlying risk, as I mentioned, but also a function of how many people purchase insurance, because there is a diversification of the risk as well that needs to be considered. And if we see the protection gap increasing, at some point this portfolio will look much more anti-selected, which will be much more risky. So of course the premiums will highlight the underlying portfolio risk. So so that's one of the challenges. So that's why, as we mentioned, the solution for resilience is top down and bottom up both. We need to mitigate, and we also have to keep the protection gap low.
Not an easy question that you sent our way, Mike, but no, I think it's a really important question to ask, because I think one of the assumptions here is, are we, how are we paying for it if it as is, right? Because currently, as the events become more frequent and more catastrophic, we are paying for it one way or another. Governments are paying for it through taxes. Governments are paying for it through various other ways to figure out how to pay for this. So it's a question of how does our society holistically end up paying for the impacts of climate change. I think what insurance can do is to put a price on that risk, so communities can make a decision around where does risk mitigation play a role, where does adaptation play a role, and where does risk transfer play a role. So there's a question around what role does, you know, the pricing that insurance industry places on a risk is more around how do we go back to, I forget who brought this up, about a holistic risk management plan for a community. The reality is climate change is making these events worse. It is costing our society as a whole, whether they're insured or not. But now is the time for us to figure out what does that pricing mean for us to make those smart decisions about that mitigation and adaptation, so that we can be better prepared for the future.
Thanks, Serena, and thanks, Raghavir. Yeah, a tough and very important question. And I think it does link back to the common theme here of how do we as a society merge together how we look at risk mitigation and risk transfer so that we can protect as many people as possible, most effectively as possible. So thank you to all of our panelists, and thank you to the audience for being here. We're running up against our time limit here. I know this is a conversation that will continue through multiple webinars and hopefully lots of future work, both in the public sector and the private sector and amongst researchers. I do want to leave you with one, or actually two stats to be a little bit uplifting at the end of a climate talk here. And, the first is that many studies show that for every dollar we spend in pre-disaster risk reduction, it saves many dollars on the recovery side. And so there are ways to try to mitigate before these events happen. And the second thing is that this report tries very hard to merge together nature, insurance, and mitigation. And there are studies that show that seagrasses not only mitigate the waves from storm surges, but also store carbon for hundreds of years. And so there are solutions out there that may at least partially address many of the problems that are built into the resilient idea. So thank you very much, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye now.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.